She knelt before him in the shadow of crumbling stone, her palms pressed against cold earth, and the weight of his gaze fell upon her like a crown she never asked to wear. The air between them trembled with what could not be spoken, desire wrapped in dread, power wrapped in restraint. His hand hovered near her face, close enough to feel the heat of her breath, far enough to leave her suspended in the agony of almost. Around them, the world held its breath. The candles flickered, the walls listened, and somewhere in the distance, a door closed with the finality of a fate decided without permission. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us which city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The manor stood like a wound against the hillside, its windows dark as empty eyes, its gardens overgrown with thorns that seemed to grow deliberately, as if protecting something no one was meant to find. She had arrived 3 days prior, clutching nothing but a worn letter and a name she'd been told never to speak aloud. The servants who met her at the gate had looked at her with something between pity and warning, their faces pale beneath their caps, their voices barely rising above whispers as they led her through corridors that smelled of lavender and decay. They called her Evelyn, though she'd been called other things before: orphan, burden, the girl with no family name, the one who didn't belong. She'd been raised in the charity house on the edge of town, where the floors were always cold and kindness came with conditions. The matrons there had taught her to read and sew, to keep her eyes down and her voice soft, to understand that her place in the world was a courtesy, not a right. When the letter came, sealed with black wax and bearing the crest of the Thornwood estate, the matrons had crossed themselves and handed it to her with trembling fingers. She was summoned. That was all the letter said. No explanation, no greeting, just an address and a date. She'd arrived on time because she'd learned long ago that people like her couldn't afford to be late. The room they gave her was in the east wing, high enough that she could see the moors stretching toward the horizon like a dark sea frozen in mid-wave. The furniture was old but elegant, covered in dust cloths that she removed carefully, folding them with hands that had been trained to treat even forgotten things with reverence. A mirror hung on the wall, its silver backing tarnished, and when she looked into it, a reflection seemed like someone else, a girl with dark hair that fell too wild around her shoulders, eyes too large for her thin face, skin that bore the faint marks of poverty, the pallor, the shadows, the look of someone who'd learned to make herself small. She unpacked her single bag, 2 dresses, both gray, a comb with missing teeth, a book of poetry she'd stolen from the Charity House library because no one ever noticed what she took. She placed the book under her pillow like a secret, like proof that some part of her still believed in beauty. That first night, she heard the footsteps. They came after midnight, when the house had settled into its nocturnal breathing, when the candles had burned low, and the servants had retreated to wherever servants went when their duties ended. The sound moved through the corridor outside her room, slow, measured, the rhythm of someone who walked without urgency because time itself bent to their will. She sat up in bed, her heart suddenly loud in her chest, her breath catching in her throat like a trapped bird. The footsteps stopped outside her door. She waited, frozen, watching the thin line of light beneath the doorframe, expecting it to darken with shadow, expecting the handle to turn. But nothing happened. The silence stretched and stretched, pulling taut like a string about to snap. Then, just as slowly as they'd come, the footsteps retreated, fading into the depths of the house until she wondered if she'd imagined them. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat by the window, watching the moors turn silver under the moon, and tried to understand why she'd been brought here, to this place that felt less like a house and more like something waiting. Morning came with fog so thick it erased the world beyond the gardens. She dressed in one of her gray dresses, pinned her hair back with careful precision, and made her way downstairs, following the scent of bread and tea to the servants' dining hall. The cook, a heavy woman with flour on her apron and suspicion in her eyes, gestured for her to sit. The other servants barely looked at her, their conversations dying the moment she entered, resuming only in whispers after she'd taken her place at the end of the table. "You're the new one," the cook said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." "He sent for you?" Evelyn nodded, unsure what else to say. The cook exchanged glances with the others, a wordless communication that left Evelyn feeling like she'd already failed some test she didn't know she was taking. "Best keep to yourself," the cook said finally, setting a plate before her. "Don't wander, don't ask questions, and whatever you do, stay away from the West Wing." The bread was fresh but tasteless in Evelyn's mouth. She wanted to ask why, wanted to understand what kind of place this was, but the warning in the cook's eyes was clear enough. So she ate in silence, tasting fear more than food. And when she was finished, she was given her duties, cataloging the library, a task that would keep her occupied and, more importantly, keep her out of the way. A library was vast, a cathedral of books that rose 3 stories high, its shelves reaching toward a ceiling painted with scenes of myths she half remembered from childhood. Gods and monsters, lovers and tragedies, all rendered in colors that had faded to the softness of memory. Dust motes danced in the slim shafts of light that managed to penetrate the heavy curtains, and the air smelled of leather and paper and time itself. She began her work methodically, moving from shelf to shelf with a ledger and pen, recording titles in careful handwriting. The books were old, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed. She found volumes in languages she couldn't read, treatises on subjects she'd never heard of, collections of poetry that made her fingers linger on their covers. Hours passed like minutes as she lost herself in the rhythm of the task, the silence broken only by the scratch of her pen and the whisper of pages turning. She didn't notice him at first. He'd entered so quietly that his presence registered only as a shift in the air, a sudden awareness that she was no longer alone. When she finally looked up, he was standing at the far end of the aisle, perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that made her forget how to breathe. He was tall, dressed in black that seemed to absorb the light around him, his hair dark as ink and push it back from a face that could have been carved from marble. Beautiful in the way that ancient statues are beautiful, cold and perfect and somehow terrible. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart, pale as winter morning, sharp as broken glass, holding depths she couldn't fathom. She should have looked away. Every instinct told her to lower her gaze, to remember her place, to show the deference that people like her owed to people like him. But something held her frozen, caught in the gravity of his attention, like a moth pinned to velvet. "You're the girl from the letter," he said. His voice was low, textured like smoke. carrying an accent she couldn't place. Something old, something that belonged to another century. "Yes, sir." Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended, barely more than a whisper. He moved closer, his footsteps silent on the Persian rug, and she noticed things she shouldn't have had time to notice. The sharp line of his jaw, the way his hands hung at his sides with predatory grace, the faint scar that traced his left temple like a silver thread. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that she could smell him. Sandalwood and rain and something darker. Something that made her pulse quicken with alarm she couldn't name. "Do you know why you're here?" She shook her head, her fingers gripping the ledger so tightly the edges cut into her palms. His gaze traveled over her face with a thoroughness that felt like touch, cataloging her features the way she'd been cataloging his books. "You look like her," he said finally, and there was something in his voice, pain perhaps, or recognition, or both. "Like who?" But he didn't answer. Instead, he reached past her, his arm brushing her shoulder as he pulled a book from the shelf behind her head. The contact was brief, barely there, but it sent electricity coursing through her body, a shock of awareness that left her shaking. He stepped back, the book in his hand, and for a moment their eyes met again, and she saw something flicker in those pale depths. Hunger, maybe, or longing, or some emotion she had no name for. "Continue your work," he said, and then he was gone, moving through the library with the same supernatural silence he'd arrived with, leaving her alone with her racing heart and the lingering scent of sandalwood in the air. She stood trembling for a long time after he'd left, her body betraying her with sensations she'd never experienced, heat pooling low in her stomach, skin too sensitive, breath too shallow. She pressed her palms against her flushed cheeks and tried to steady herself, tried to make sense of what had just happened. But the library suddenly felt too small, too close, as if the walls themselves were pressing in on her. That night, she learned his name from the whispers of servants gathered in the kitchen. Lord Matthias Thornwood, master of the estate, last of his bloodline. They spoke of him with reverence and fear, their voices dropping to hushed tones when they mentioned how he never aged, how he'd looked the same for as long as anyone could remember, how the townspeople crossed themselves when his carriage passed, and mothers warned their daughters never to meet his eyes. Some called him cursed, others called him blessed. All agreed that he was dangerous, that something about him wasn't quite human, that the house itself bent to his will like a living thing responding to its master's mood. Evelyn lay in her bed that night, staring at the ceiling, and tried not to think about the way he'd looked at her, the way he'd said she looked like someone. But sleep wouldn't come, and when it finally did, her dreams were filled with pale eyes and shadows that moved with purpose, and a voice calling her name in a language she'd never learned but somehow understood. The days that followed established a pattern. She worked in the library, cataloging and organizing, and he would appear without warning, always silent, always watching. Sometimes he would speak, brief questions about her progress, observations about particular books, comments that seemed designed to test her somehow. Other times, he would simply stand there, his presence filling the space between them with a tension that made her hands shake and her concentration fracture. She learned to sense when he was near before she saw him, some primal part of her brain registering the shift in atmosphere, the way the air grew heavier and the silence deeper. She learned the sound of his footsteps, or lack thereof, the way shadows moved differently when he passed through them, the way time itself seemed to slow when he entered a room. And she learned though she tried desperately not to, that her body responded to him in ways that frightened her. That every glance felt like being touched, that the space between them hummed with something she'd only read about in the poetry she kept hidden under her pillow. The other servants noticed. She could feel their eyes on her during meals, hear their whispers when she passed in the corridors. The cook watched her with something like pity, shaking her head when Evelyn tried to help with evening preparations. "Best stay clear, girl," she muttered. "Nothing good comes from catching his attention." But it was too late for that. His attention was already caught, held, focused on her with an intensity that felt both terrifying and inevitable, like standing in the path of a storm and knowing there was nowhere left to run. It was on the 8th night that everything changed. She'd been working late in the library, trying to finish cataloging a particularly difficult section of manuscripts when the storm rolled in. Thunder shook the windows, and lightning turned the lamps flickered, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and she stood to light more candles before the darkness could claim the room entirely. She was reaching for the candelabra when she felt him behind her. So close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, so close that his breath stirred the loose strands of hair at her neck. "You should rest," he said softly, and his voice in the darkness sent shivers cascading down her spine. She turned slowly, careful not to let their bodies touch, but the space between them was measured in inches, not feet, and she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. In the candlelight, they seemed to glow with their own luminescence, pale as moonlight on water, and she realized with a jolt of fear that she could see hunger there, raw and undisguised. "I wanted to finish," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm raging outside. "Why?" The question caught her off guard. "Because it's my duty. Because you hired me to." "That's not why." He raised his hand, and she flinched slightly, but he didn't touch her. His fingers hovered near her face, tracing. "I can hear your heartbeat when I enter a room. I can smell your fear, your confusion." His hand finally made contact, his fingers brushing her jaw with impossible gentleness, and she gasped at the coolness of his touch, at the way it sent electricity racing through her veins. "You feel it too, this recognition, as if we've known each other before." She wanted to pull away. Every rational part of her brain screamed at her to run, to escape this moment before it consumed her entirely. But her body wouldn't obey, held captive by his touch, by the magnetic pull of his presence, by something deeper than fear or logic. "Who do I look like?" she heard herself ask, her voice trembling. His expression shifted, pain flashing across his features like lightning across a dark sky. "Someone I lost. Someone I've been searching for." His thumb traced her lower lip, and she felt herself leaning into the touch, despite herself. "Someone I swore I would find again, no matter how many lifetimes it took." Before she could respond, before she could process what he was saying, he pulled away abruptly, as if her skin had burned him. The absence of his touch left her cold, bereft, aching with loss she didn't understand. "Go to your room," he said, his voice rough now, strained. "Lock the door. Don't come out until morning." "Why?" "Because I'm not safe tonight." He turned away from her, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Because the storm makes me remember things I've tried to forget. Because if you stay here, I will do something we'll both regret." She ran, through the corridors, up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the darkness, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. She reached her room and slammed the door, turning the key with shaking hands. pressing her back against the wood as if she could hold back whatever force pursued her. But nothing followed. Only silence. Only the storm outside, raging against the windows like it was trying to break through, trying to reach her. She slid to the floor, her breath coming in gasps, her body trembling with a mixture of fear and something else, something hot and confusing that pooled in her stomach and made her skin feel too tight. She pressed her hands to her face and felt the wetness of tears she hadn't realized she'd shed. What was happening to her? What was this place? What was he? The questions spiraled through her mind without answers, accompanied by the memory of his touch, the look in his eyes, the barely restrained hunger that had radiated from him like heat from flame. She understood in that moment that she'd stumbled into something far beyond her comprehension. Something ancient and powerful and utterly beyond her control. And the most terrifying part was that some dark corner of her soul didn't want to escape. Some treacherous part of her wanted to walk back down those stairs, wanted to stand before him again, wanted to see what would happen if she stayed. The storm raged all night, and she didn't sleep. She sat by the window, watching lightning illuminate the moors, and tried not to think about pale eyes and cold fingers and the promise of something that felt like destiny wearing the mask of doom. When morning came, pale and gray, she found a note slipped under her door. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, written in ink that seemed almost black-red in the dim light. "Forgive me. I should never have touched you. It won't happen again. Continue your work. Stay away from me, for both our sakes." She read it 3 times, her fingers trembling, before folding it carefully and tucking it into the poetry book under her pillow. Then she dressed, pinned back her hair, and made her way downstairs as if nothing had changed, as if the world hadn't shifted on its axis the night before. But everything had changed. She could feel it in the way the servants looked at her, in the way the house itself seemed to watch her movements, in the way her own body felt different, awakened to something she'd been mercifully ignorant of before. And though she tried to obey his command, tried to focus on her work and ignore his presence, she knew with certainty that it was already too late. Whatever had begun between them couldn't be stopped by distance or denial or locked doors. The hunt had started long before she'd arrived at Thornwood Manor. She'd just been too innocent to realize she was the prey. The library became her sanctuary and her prison. She arrived early each morning, her arms full of cleaning supplies and fresh candles, determined to lose herself in the methodical work of restoration. The books needed her. Their spines were cracked, their pages brittle, their stories trapped behind layers of neglect. She could fix this, at least. She could bring order to chaos, even if she couldn't bring order to the confusion raging inside her own chest. He kept his distance, as promised. Days passed without a single encounter, and she told herself this was for the best, that the space between them was necessary, protective, but the house itself seemed to conspire against her resolution. She would turn a corner and catch his scent lingering in the air, sandalwood and rain, and that darker note she couldn't name. She would enter the library and find books pulled from shelves she hadn't yet reached, left open to pages of poetry about love and loss and longing. She would wake in the night and hear those footsteps in the corridor, pausing outside her door, waiting there in the darkness before moving on. The servants stopped speaking when she entered rooms. The cook no longer offered advice or warnings, just looked at her with resignation. As if Evelyn's fate had already been sealed and there was no point in fighting it. Even the other maids kept their distance, crossing themselves when they passed her in the halls, whispering prayers under their breath like she carried contagion. On the 10th day, Lady Catherine arrived. Evelyn was dusting the upper shelves when the commotion started. The sound of carriage wheels on gravel, the sudden flurry of servants rushing to the entrance hall, voices raised in greeting that held an edge of panic. She climbed down from her ladder and moved to the window, peering through the heavy curtains to see a black carriage bearing a crest she didn't recognize. Its door opened by a footman to reveal a woman dressed in deep purple, her posture perfect, her movements calculated and graceful. Even from a distance, Evelyn could feel the power radiating from her, the kind of power that came from bloodline and wealth, and the absolute certainty that the world would bend to accommodate her desires. "That's Lady Catherine Ashworth," one of the younger maids whispered, appearing at Evelyn's elbow. Her eyes were wide with something between excitement and fear. "She's been trying to marry Lord Thornwood for years. They say she's from one of the old families like his. They say she understands him in ways no normal woman could." The emphasis on normal wasn't lost on Evelyn. She let the curtain fall back into place and returned to her work, her stomach churning with an emotion she refused to name. It wasn't jealousy. She had no claim to him, no right to feel anything about whom he entertained or married. She was just a servant, an orphan hired to catalog books, nothing more. But her hands shook as she tried to reshelve a volume. And when she heard the library door open behind her, she knew without turning who had entered. "So this is where you've been hiding her," Lady Catherine's voice was silk wrapped around steel, cultured and cold. "The little mouse I've been hearing so much about." Evelyn turned slowly, keeping her eyes lowered in the subservient pose she'd perfected over years of survival. Lady Catherine stood in the doorway, magnificent in her purple gown, her auburn hair piled high, her throat adorned with diamonds that caught the light like captured stars. She was beautiful in the way paintings are beautiful, untouchable, perfect, utterly without warmth. And behind her, keeping a careful distance but unable to hide his presence, stood Lord Thornwood. Evelyn's eyes found his for just a moment, the single heartbeat of connection, and what she saw there made her breath catch. Apology, warning, and beneath it all, that same hunger, barely leashed, straining against the cage of his control. "She doesn't look like much," Lady Catherine continued, moving into the room with predatory grace, circling Evelyn like a falcon assessing prey. Rather plain, actually, small, undernourished. Is this really the girl causing such disruption? "Catherine," Lord Thornwood's voice held a warning, but Lady Catherine ignored him, reaching out to grab Evelyn's chin, forcing her face upward into the light. "Let me see you properly." Her grip was painful, her nails pressing into Evelyn's skin. "Ah, yes, I see it now, the resemblance." She released Evelyn with a laugh that held no humor. "How pathetically predictable, Matthias. After all these years, you're still chasing ghosts. That's enough." His voice dropped to a tone that made the air itself seem to freeze. "Let her go." "Or what?" Lady Catherine turned to face him, her smile sharp as broken glass. "You'll defend her? This common little orphan? This replacement for something you can never have back?" She moved closer to him, her hand reaching up to touch his face with possessive familiarity. "How many times must we repeat this cycle before you accept the truth? She's gone, Matthias." "She's been gone for 200 years. No matter how many poor girls you collect who bear her face, none of them will be her. The silence that followed was suffocating. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind racing to process what she'd just heard. 200 years. Replacement. Ghosts. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. The servant's fear, the way he never aged, the ancient quality to everything about him. He wasn't cursed or blessed. He was something else entirely. "Get out," he said to Lady Catherine, his voice utterly flat, devoid of emotion. "Leave my house. Now." Gladly, Lady Catherine adjusted her gloves with deliberate precision. "But remember, when you've tired of this one, when she disappoints you as all the others have, I'll still be here. I'll always be here, waiting for you to stop this foolish mourning and accept what you truly are." She paused at the door, glancing back at Evelyn with eyes like blue ice. "Enjoy him while you can, little mouse, but don't mistake his attention for love. You're just another ghost he's trying to resurrect. And when he realizes you're nothing but flesh and blood, he'll discard you like all the rest." The door slammed behind her, the sound echoing through the library like a gunshot. Evelyn stood trembling, her arms wrapped around herself, unable to look at him, unable to process the implications of what she'd just learned. "Evelyn! Is it true?" Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Am I just a replacement? Someone who looks like someone you lost?" He moved closer, and she wanted to retreat, but her back was already against the bookshelf, nowhere left to go. He stopped just out of reach, his hands clenched at his sides, as if restraining himself from touching her. Her name was Elise. She was everything, light and laughter and life, and I loved her with an intensity that should have been impossible, even for someone like me. His voice was rough, scraped raw with emotion. When she died, the way she moved, the tilt of her head, it was like seeing a ghost made flesh. He paused, his jaw clenching. "But Catherine is wrong. You're not a replacement. Because the more time I spend near you, the more I realize that you're not her at all. You're someone entirely different, someone who makes me feel things I haven't felt in longer than you can imagine." What things? She shouldn't ask, shouldn't encourage this. But the words escaped before she could stop them. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the raw hunger there stole her breath. Desire, need, the terrifying possibility that I might be able to love again, even though I swore I never would, even though loving you would be the most selfish, dangerous thing I could do. Her heart was pounding so hard she could barely hear over the rush of blood in her ears. Why dangerous? Because of what I am. Because I can't give you a normal life, a normal love. Because everyone who gets close to me either runs screaming or ends up destroyed. He reached up, his hand trembling slightly as it hovered near her face. Because I'm not safe, Evelyn. I've never been safe. And you deserve so much better than what I could offer you. She should run. She should take this opportunity to escape, to find another position somewhere far away from Thornwood Manor and its haunted master. But instead, she found herself leaning into his almost touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Maybe I don't want safe," she whispered. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back, and she saw something break in his expression, the last threads of his control snapping like old rope under too much weight. His hand finally made contact, cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted the intensity burning in his eyes. "You don't know what you're saying. Then tell me. Explain it to me. Tell me what you are, what this place is, what I've stumbled into." She reached up. her fingers circling his wrist, feeling the coolness of his skin, the steady pulse beneath that beat too slowly to be entirely human. I'm tired of half-truths and warnings. If I'm in danger, I deserve to know why. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with infinite care. Then he pulled away, moving to the window, his silhouette dark against the gray light filtering through the curtains. I was born in 1642, he began, his voice distant, as if speaking from memory pulled him back through time. The youngest son of a minor noble family, insignificant in every way that mattered to the world. I was 23 when I met her. Elise, she was the daughter of a merchant, far below my station. But that didn't matter. Nothing mattered except her. He fell silent for a moment, and Evelyn waited, barely breathing, afraid that any sound would shatter the fragile spell that held his confession. We married in secret. For 3 years, I was happier than I'd ever been or thought I could be. And then the plague came. His hands clenched on the windowsill. It took her in 3 days. 3 days of fever and suffering. And there was nothing I could do. Nothing except watch her die, watch the light leave her eyes, and know that she was gone forever. I'm sorry, Evelyn whispered, her heart aching for him despite everything. Don't be, not yet. He turned back to face her, and she saw the shadow of ancient pain etched into his features. Because I couldn't accept it, couldn't let her go. I sought out every legend, every dark rumor, every whisper of magic or miracle that might bring her back. And eventually I found something. Someone, a woman who claimed she could give me what I wanted, immortality, so I could search through every lifetime until I found Elise's soul reborn. Understanding dawned, cold and terrible. She made you into what you are now. He nodded. Vampire, demon, cursed one. I've been called many things over the centuries. The specifics don't matter. What matters is that I've lived for nearly 400 years, watching the world change, watching everyone I've ever known turn to dust. Searching for one soul among billions. His laugh was bitter. And do you know what I've learned? That souls don't reincarnate conveniently. That love doesn't transcend death as neatly as the poets claim. That I've wasted centuries chasing a fantasy while becoming a monster in the process. Evelyn's mind reeled, trying to reconcile the man before her, beautiful, tragic, achingly human despite his claims, with the monster he described. You don't seem like a monster to me. That's because you haven't seen what I'm capable of, what I've done. The people I've hurt, the lives I've destroyed, all in pursuit of something I can never have. He moved closer again, and this time there was something desperate in his approach. But then you arrived, with her face and her eyes. And for a moment, just a moment, I let myself hope. And that's when I realized how different you are. How your kindness isn't performative, how your strength comes from endurance rather than ignorance, how you look at me without fear, even when you should be terrified. I am terrified, she admitted, but not of you. Of this, of whatever this is between us. He stopped inches away, and the air between them crackled with tension so thick she could taste it. There is no us, Evelyn. There can't be, because I'm damned and you're innocent and I won't drag you down into darkness with me. Don't I get a say in this? No. His hand lifted to her face again, and this time his touch lingered, his thumb brushing her lower lip with heartbreaking tenderness. Because if I gave you a choice, you might choose wrong. You might choose me. And I care about you too much to let that happen. Before she could respond, he was gone, moving with supernatural speed, leaving her alone in the library with her racing heart and trembling hands, and the phantom sensation of his touch still burning against her skin. She sank into the nearest chair, her legs no longer able to support her weight, and tried to process everything she'd learned. Vampire, immortal, 400 years of searching for a lost love. And somehow, impossibly, she'd become tangled in his tragedy. The rational part of her brain screamed that she should leave immediately, should pack her single bag and flee into the night without looking back. But a deeper part, the part that had always felt out of place in the world, that had never quite belonged anywhere, recognized something in him. A loneliness that matched her own, a desperate search for connection in a world that seemed determined to keep them isolated. She touched her lips where his thumb had rested and felt tears sliding down her cheeks. Not tears of fear, but of recognition, of understanding that she'd finally found someone who saw her, really saw her, not as a burden or a servant or a replacement, but as herself. And knowing that he would push her away precisely because he cared. The cruelty of it was almost poetic. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold. She watched the light fade, watched shadows claim the room, and made a decision that was probably foolish and possibly fatal, but felt more right than anything she'd ever done. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to let him face his eternity alone, convinced he was a monster unworthy of love. She was going to stay and fight and prove to him that some connections transcended curses and centuries and the weight of impossible history, even if it destroyed her in the process. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like the first truly free choice she'd ever made. If this story found a mirror in your soul, leave your comment and share. Sometimes, what hurts within us is what makes us most human.